I feel like almost every day I'm discovering something new about making music in Ableton Live. For instance, the last video I made, we covered how you can basically comp MIDI tracks together and then build your session view basically literally as you're writing the song. And there are also producers like myself where we like to use samples for slicing and triggering sounds, which can produce really cool ideas even if you're working from one of these pre-made loops you get in the sample packs. When you slice stuff, you start to think of audio loops not as something you just, drag and drop into a session, but as like a whole different kind of resource to chop something and create something really interesting with, something really new sounding. Another amazing thing about slicing is, let's say you have a MIDI keyboard in your studio, but the whole idea of playing the piano is just way over your head right now. Triggering slices will get your fingers using the keyboard because it's just about making sound. So you don't have to be an expert piano player, no chords, arpeggio, scales, all that stuff. But basically it sidesteps the idea of having to play all that stuff and just triggering sounds with your MIDI keyboard and just using your hands to make music, which is always a really fun thing. And kind of the typical thing with slicing that music producers do is, let's say you have something simple like a little drum beat I have here. Typically what people would do is they would go to instruments, maybe something like simpler for triggering these kinds of samples, and then literally drag and drop it into there, going into the slice mode. And then you can actually pick out individual slices, you can make this screen much bigger, and it does a pretty good job of analyzing it based on the transients, which in a drum beat obviously are going to be pretty clear, and then you can trigger it from the MIDI keyboard. And basically write your own beat if you want to, using the sounds that you liked in the loop. So you can start to think of drum loops as resources for drum one-shots or single samples, and then just use MIDI to trigger your own, custom beat from there. Now that's one typical way of doing things in Ableton, but you'll notice there's some other features that you can test out. Like for instance, instead of using simpler and dragging, dropping it into a separate instrument, you can just right click on the clip itself. If you go down to these options, you can see convert drums to new MIDI track, for instance. And Ableton's basically going to analyze the clip and do all that for you, but in this case, it's going to the Ableton drum rack, where you're going to have macro controls you could take advantage of, and every single sample is now kind of turned into a single sample one shot, which is really cool. You kind of instantly have a drum kit you can utilize. But another way of doing this is if you right click on the clip and go to slice to new MIDI track, where it's going to give you a new window where you have a little more options as to how you slice it. So you can pick it based on warp marker, transient, or bar down to other subdivisions, which is also really useful. And it basically does the same thing, slicing it into a drum rack preset, which is really, really cool. And if you're someone that likes to use drum pads, you might find this interface just more intuitive to use. But this is just assuming you're doing this with drums. Very typical thing to slice drum loops. But I want to take this video much further today in a really interesting direction, because you can also slice MIDI. And this is where things get really interesting. Let's just say we have, I'll just grab a typical piano sound. Now, whether you're recording the MIDI yourself, like we talked about in the last video, or you're grabbing something from a good MIDI pack, either way, you can start here. So I'm just going to record something in real quick for this video. Okay, cool. So imagine you made up something or you grabbed it from a MIDI pack. I kind of played this sort of like a chord sequence where you can see the figure is descending down. There's a little bit of improvisation on it as well, but you'll find a lot of these things like chord maps is a popular thing used in MIDI packs. I think it still is anyway. These are things that are resources you can utilize if you don't play piano. And a lot of people just stop there. They grab the MIDI, they try to put an instrument on it, and they go from there. But the recent updates in Ableton make it a lot easier to convert this MIDI into something you can chop up and manipulate, just like a drum loop, for instance. If I right click and go to bounce to new track, or just the shortcut, which is Control B or Command B, this now gets transported into an audio loop. And what's interesting is you can slice this just like we did with the drum loop. So I right click and go to slice to new MIDI track. And the cool thing is with any of these kind of chord sequence MIDI clips or a piano MIDI clip is you can just convert it to something that you can slice, and this will turn it into a very similar thing like a drum kit. And you'll notice that when you're triggering slices of something like a piano or a synth or a guitar loop, you get this really cool choppier sound. It's really nice for doing it with hip hop, but you could do it with other great genres too, like indie rock and EDM. And you'll notice over here, you also have these snapshots, which are going to manipulate these pre-made macro controls, which are really intuitive. I really like swell. So basically everything now just sounds reversed. So you have all these chops that you can kind of just randomly play on the keyboard. You don't need to be a keyboard player. And they will also loop in a really interesting way. You can go to loop slices. That's a really fun way to create a more percussive sound. And they even have a snapshot called percussive, which gives it more of a staccato feel. And I actually discovered something also really interesting about this. If I go back to the hold snapshot, you'll see a macro feature called loop off full. And let's say I just hold down a random sample. This will basically change the way it's looping that sample. So if it's totally off, it just goes through the sample, but full on, it keeps looping it. But when you move the macro, particularly going like clockwise direction, it gives us this sort of like rat-a-tat-tat kind of rhythm to how you're looping samples. So this is a pretty cool idea, and there's a way that you can actually make this happen without having to manually, do it with your hand. And that's where we get into the modulators part of your menu. A lot of people kind of overlook this part of your Explorer in Ableton, and you have a thing called envelope MIDI, which is basically something you can place before this whole drum rack setup that is an independent envelope that you can affect other things with. So for instance, I'll map this to loop off full, and now this envelope is actually moving with that parameter. And if you want to go for that kind of rat-a-tat-tat sound, you can basically go to this mod area, which determines how much or in what direction it's actually modifying it with the envelope. I'm just going to go reverse. So instead of plus 50%, you go minus 50 something percent. And then I'll change other things, like I might make this attack a little bit longer, go more towards 140 or something like that, make the decay a little bit longer, bring the sustain down, turn the release up as well. You can also affect the curves of the attack and the decay, which is going to give it a really cool swing, or change the shape of how these things move in the envelope. Maybe go for this direction. So you should end up with something that kind of looks like this. And here I have an example of this in action with another piano loop. And it gives it a really cool sound that's just fun to play on the keyboard. I'm just going to hit, maybe 2 keys. And a similar trick you might have missed in the last video we did on the channel. By the way, hit the like button and subscribe if you're into making music on Ableton, because you don't want to miss these videos. We did show take lanes with MIDI. So if I right click on this track and I go to show take lanes, it'll show the take I just recorded, but I can also try out alternate ones. I'm gonna make sure I turn off the MIDI overdub button, and I can just play in other ideas using this cool looping feature now, and then see which ones I like. So I can try some different ones out. Try another one. And now I have 3 separate takes that I can audition as the drums are playing, choose which one I like the best, just hitting enter on each one I select. And if I decide I like all of them, I can transfer them over into the session view so I can have a more non-linear way of making music by right-clicking on that master track and going to consolidate time to new scene. Again, I did this in the last video, so make sure you subscribe so you don't miss these things. But yeah, I'll go ahead and do that. And now when I go ahead to my session view, you can see it exported that clip, that MIDI clip, with the accompanying drum loop. So whatever's happening, next to each other, I'll make sure they're physically next to each other. Whatever's happening next to each other in the loop will get brought over into your session view. And so in this way, you could take all the ones that you like just from looking at the show take lanes, and I can just do this, consolidate time to new scene. I like this one as well, let's say. Consolidate time to new scene. And now, if I wanted to trigger this as, you know, a remixable song or a live performance or just some non-linear format of your song, it's just all automatically over here now. And by the way, if you guys are new to this channel, I have a whole series on synthesis for beginners that primarily uses Ableton Live stock instruments. In particular, right now, the lessons are using just Ableton Live Drift, which is the entry-level synth with Ableton. So you might be on Ableton Intro, not standard or suite right now. You can still follow along with these lessons. And at the end of every lesson, you end up with a preset that you've built yourself. You will completely understand how to make a really practical sound type in Ableton. Think great basses, arpeggiations, how to use an LFO, all those really practical things. And I think the whole purpose of that course is to make people feel like you can finally understand synthesis for yourself and you're not totally reliant on presets and just not feeling like you know what you're doing. And the Patreon itself has tons of Ableton downloads, different collections for stuff. We have a vocal production summer course going on right now, vocal chains, Ableton FL Studio, a MIDI library, guitar samples, tons of stuff. I'll post links to the current course series down below so you don't miss them. And yeah, I hope you guys got some inspiration from this one. I'll see you all soon. Have fun making music.